New Orleans will soon become the largest U.S. city without a daily newspaper. And as many famous U.S. titles continue to struggle in the digital age, how will traditional newspapers survive? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Anand Naidoo. It's a newspaper that played a crucial role in helping New Orleans and its people in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, earning it the Pulitzer Prize for journalism. But now, after more than 175 years, the city's Times-Picayune newspaper has announced it's slashing print publications from 7 to 3 days per week. New Orleans may now be the biggest U.S. city without a daily newspaper, but it's not the only one. A string of famous U.S. newspaper titles are also struggling to stay afloat. The reason? The continuing digital revolution in the way news is consumed, with more and more people preferring to pick and choose stories from a variety of online sources. In the face of this, traditional news outlets have been struggling to find the perfect online business model, with many of us too used to getting our news for free. But then there's the billionaire entrepreneur Warren Buffett. He appears to still have faith in print journalism, last week buying more than 60 newspapers. So is it premature to say we're witnessing the death of the newspaper industry? So where does the newspaper industry go to from here? With me to discuss this in the studio is Paul Farhi, media reporter for the Washington Post. Next to him, Andrea Stone. She's the senior national correspondent for the Huffington Post, a leading online newspaper. And from New York, Clay Shirky, a professor and new media expert at New York University. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I guess the broad question is, are newspapers doomed in the United States? And it's not a new question. It's been discussed for a long time. The latest we hear, of course, is of the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. Andrea, I'm wondering, should we be surprised at this latest development in New Orleans?
Unfortunately not. I spent most of my career at USA Today, so I've been a newspaper reporter for most of that time until I came online 2.5 years ago. And before that, there was talk actually at Gannett Corporation, which owns USA Today. Our paper in Detroit was experimenting with going less than 7 days a week. So it's not a new thing, but it's a very troubling one. I think there was a photograph on the internet that went viral last week showing the staff meeting at the Times-Picayune, and the faces of the staffers were just really depressing.
It's very depressing, yeah. Well, and I got to admit, I started out on newspapers as well. Don't you miss the romance of newspapers? Will you ever go back?
Never will go back. I never thought I would go online. I always thought if my name was not in print on a piece of paper, it wasn't there for the ages. But now I realize it's exactly the opposite. At the Huffington Post, where we're always linking to other stories, invariably I've reported on something and I'll want to link back to it, and after a certain amount of time, it's not there, except in a scrapbook up in my attic. So no, I think really for eternity, and online is where it's at. And I get my news on my phone now, or on my iPad, or on the internet. And I've already read. I get the New York Times delivered at my home, and I've already read most of what's in there by the time it gets there.
And the attention span online is very short, as you point out.
Right.
Let's go to Clay Shirky in New York. Clay, when we look at the evolution of newspapers, now you have talked of 3 different models for newspapers. One is seen as the product for sale, like newspapers have a product that they're selling, like Cheerios or Coca-Cola or toothpaste or whatever. Yep. Then you have the subscriber model, which is what the New York Times follows. And then you have the model which the LA Times follows, as you've pointed out, which is more like this is a club, and if you want to belong to this club, you have to pay.
Right.
What is the difference between these 3 models?
Well, the crazy thing is the difference between those 3 models is actually almost all mindset and the culture of the newsroom. You have papers who are all doing the same thing online, which is to say they have this page limit threshold, 10 pages, 20 pages. After that, we will charge you. So there is a move towards that as a nearly universal model for anytime you're trying to get fees from the readers, but they characterize it in very different ways. And what's really surprising about the news industry, at least the newspaper part of the industry, is how committed they are to the idea that they sell a product and that this is a transaction with the buyers. When in fact, when you adopt that page threshold model, 90% of the audience never pays. So in fact, the newspaper business, one way or another, has gotten out of the business of charging each person for access to the news. The big open question, I think, is between the subscriber model, which is what the argument the New York Times is making, this is a transaction, but we are holding you at arm's length, versus what the Los Angeles Times is saying, which is when you give us this money, you're not just buying a product because you know most of the people reading the LA Times are not paying. You're actually giving us this money to support our operations. So it's much more of a civic commitment and a membership model. And I think that more and more papers are going to be pushed towards that membership model, because ultimately in any given newspaper, there's only about 5 to 10% of the readers who really care if the paper lives or dies, for whom it's not just a convenience, but who would say, God forbid the New York Times go out of business, God forbid the Times-Picayune go out of business, God forbid the Christian Science Monitor go out of business. And that core, I think, is increasingly going to be the people propping those newsrooms up from the customer side.
Okay, I want to go back to that civic model a little later, but Paul, let's look at the hundreds of newspapers in the US that have closed down or drastically cut operations since the beginning of 2009. Those forced out of print include the Rocky Mountain News in Denver and the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. The Christian Science Monitor shifted online with only a weekly print edition now. Others, such as Detroit's 2 newspapers, slashed home delivery to 3 days a week. The San Francisco Chronicle narrowly avoided closure after employees made steep concessions, and some newspaper companies filed for bankruptcy protection, such as the Tribune Company, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and Freedom Communications. So the question again, do newspapers have a future? I mean, the media is very fond of reporting on the media, but is it perhaps a little bit exaggerated?
Well, newspapers have a future. It depends on what form, as Clay is mentioning, how the business model will work. The remarkable thing to me is that more newspapers haven't gone under. The ones you mentioned, Rocky Mountain, Seattle, those were 2 newspaper towns. It's clear that most metropolitan areas cannot support 2 daily newspapers. We have very few left in America. But most newspapers are still in business. They were incredibly profitable throughout the 90s, throughout much of the first half of this century as well. It's only recently that the fall has taken place. The newspaper business is about half the size it was just 5 years ago. There's no question that there is trouble, but we are falling from such a tremendous height that we still haven't hit the ground yet.
Are there more people now reading newspapers online than there are the actual newsprint?
Yeah, there are, because the internet has nationalized and internationalized newspaper reading. I can be in a foreign country and read my local newspaper. And for instance, the Washington Post probably has over 1 million readers a day online, about 500,000 buy the print copy of it.
Andrea, does the Huffington Post, for instance, have any idea of the people who read the newspaper, the internet newspaper online, where they come from, how long they stay on the site, where they go to?
They are, we have and I hope I get this right, about 37 million unique visitors reading the Huffington Post, and they're very much engaged. One of the things that we are known for is our social media, or the engagement. We just don't present the news and say, here's the news, but people are commenting. We have, through Twitter and Facebook, and our comments section, which is just amazingly robust conversations. It's not in newspapers, for years it was one way. It was, we were giving you the news. Here's, and maybe you could write a letter to the editor, and maybe we'll print it. But now everybody, it's really much more of a two-way street, and we get tips from our readers, and direction, and so it's very much more engaging. And I think that's something that the Huffington Post has really set the standard for.
Clay, is that your experience as well, that readers of internet sites for news, they're far more engaged with what they're reading rather than the old model where, newspaper produces, consumer consumes?
Yes, absolutely. The newspaper model has been, and in fact, the media model really since Gutenberg has been major provider in the center, multiple identical copies of material going out to the edges to be consumed by individuals who aren't really talking to each other outside the sort of living room or the water cooler. And that was true whether you owned a broadcast tower or a printing press. What's happened now that all the consumers are also producers, people are much more interested in talking to one another about the news and forwarding the news and taking a piece of it and putting it with a piece of something else they found elsewhere and talking about that. And that second layer of interactivity, which as Andrea says, the Huffington Post is masterful at, has created an entire an entire new kind of value around the news that newspapers have been very slow to pick up on. In fact, I think it says a lot about the Huffington Post that they can often get more traffic for a story that they are picking up from elsewhere and adding to, because the audience wants to go where other readers are. They don't want to go to the originating source, which no longer matters when, as you know, we heard news has become globalized and anybody can get to anything. They want instead to go to where their friends are. They want to talk to people about the news. They want to do things with the news. They want to be users and not just customers.
The sources
and
do
frankly,
matter.
the ability, the Huffington Post's ability in particular to recognize that value and capture it has been a huge part of their success.
Right. Sources do matter because your entire ecosystem is in some ways, and Clay will probably argue with me here, in some ways threatened by the decline of newspapers. Fewer reporters actually reporting, less news, more people aggregating the news that those reporters produce. Now, of course, reporters can report for newspapers, they can report for websites, they don't even have to be professionals, but nevertheless, the news has to come from somewhere, and it ends up going somewhere. But that is, in this case, the aggregators.
Well, I agree with Paul, but to a point, and I think that it's changing. And I think, 5 years ago, I would have definitely agreed with you. I mean, we do aggregate a lot because readers come to us because they can't go, or they don't have time to go to 100 different places. So if they know if they come, we're going to be, in the old days, we used to say, what are people talking around the water cooler? But it's basically, what are people talking about, the talkers? But, just a few weeks ago, the Huffington Post won a Pulitzer Prize for original reporting, for national reporting. David Wood did a 10-part series on wounded veterans and their treatment. That was a first. I mean, the Pulitzers only a few years ago started to even consider online-only publications for the Pulitzer. We won, Politico also won for political cartooning. So, it is changing. Yes, we do a lot of aggregating, but we also do now a lot more original reporting. It's one of the reasons that, I'm there a lot, because I do original reporting.
And you've invested a lot of money in your own investigative unit, right?
Yes, I mean, we have people who are doing investigative, there are people who write every day on the site, and there's, a lot of that. But then David Wood, who won the Pulitzer, had 7 or 8 months to work on this. I mean, that is a luxury of time and he always worked in newspapers until he came to AOL. Never had that kind of luxury.
Right.
As it turns out, though, the most aggregated and most,
I'll come to you in a moment, Clay.
most quoted sources of information on the internet happen to be the legacy media, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Al Jazeera. Those are the sources that tend to provide the foundation by which all of the aggregation that's going on is going on. We provide that for the entire internet.
Right. Clay, you wanted to say something?
In fact, just following up on the point Paul just made, I don't, in fact, want to disagree with you, Paul. I do think that the ecosystem is being threatened. In fact, that's one of the reasons I'm writing and thinking about this so much right now, because the upstream sources, many of them, as you said, the traditional newspapers, have a business model that was fantastically profitable up through 2006 and now is collapsed. But in a way, that makes newspapers' failure to essentially understand what consumer demand, what reader demand would mean. Their failure to adapt to that has left the market open for places like Huffington Post to essentially create a lot of value that readers clearly appreciate and reward, that could on some level have been the newspapers to essentially try to create. But the newspapers have been so stuck in the model of we produce and you consume that they've been very slow.
Unfortunately,
very slow to create that kind of second layer of conversational value.
Unfortunately, most newspapers are not the Washington Post or the New York Times. If you're the newspaper in Chattanooga, if you're the newspaper in Chicago even, there isn't much of an upstream a la a Huffington Post to aggregate your news. The news is still local, and you have to serve a local reader because there is no international market for your news. There's no national market for your news. It's all basically local. Could newspapers have aggregated and done some of the things that Huffington Post has done? Yes, on a smaller scale. Would it have saved the newspaper industry? That's a good question. I'm not so sure.
Something else that you mentioned, Paul, earlier on was that, anybody can become a journalist these days. I mean, we have this phenomenon of citizen journalists. I think it's best typified by what CNN does, with all these reporters sending their reports in and sending their pictures in and things like that. Hasn't that compromised journalism? I mean, what about credibility? We don't know. The traditional way journalism has been practiced is that people write stuff, it is checked, it is double-checked, it is sourced, sometimes triple-sourced.
Yes. Here's where brand names make a big difference. If the news comes from the New York Times, it has a certain level of trustworthiness. Right. You can attack it, you can say it's too liberal, you can say 100 things about it, but it has a higher level of credibility than some guy with an iPhone somewhere taking video. Those things will always matter because professionals gathering news learn a craft and learn the standards and learn the ethics of it. We don't have to be orthodox about it, but nevertheless, a professional doing something is superior to an amateur in most cases doing the same thing.
I think people know that, and I mean that does trouble me too. I mean, I do think there is a difference between citizen journalists and professional journalists, and it's more of kind of a reader or buyer beware right now, and sort of how to kind of cut through what's real. And it's true, there are certain brand names.
Are you confident that people recognize that difference?
I hope so. I mean, I'm not here to say that it's perfect. And I do think that we are evolving. And what we talked about, in 2006 will be very different than what we're talking about in 2018. I think it'll be totally changed a few years from now.
Okay. Let's look at.
One of the things I think.
Go ahead.
Just when we're talking about citizen journalism, I think one of the things we have to be aware of is that if you look at it in the old model of the journalist has one shot to get their message out to the public, which is to say the 20th century model, then the amateur versus professional thing looks sensible. But once you start to think of news as an ecosystem in which many people's outputs are other people's inputs, when you see what Andy Carvin did with his news feed during the Arab Spring, where he aggregated on-the-ground reports across Egypt, across Tunisia, Bahrain, and turned it into an almost 24-hour-a-day news feed at one point. It wasn't a question of amateurs versus professionals. There was a hybrid model that worked better than either could have on its own. And that kind of hybridization is where much of the news ecosystem is heading.
Well, let's look at a man who still has faith in newspapers. We talked about Warren Buffett, and this is what he had to say after he recently bought more than 60 newspapers. He said, "We must rethink the industry's initial response to the internet. The original instinct of newspapers then was to offer free in digital form what they were charging for in print. This is an unsustainable model." Buffett went on to describe his future purchasing plans. "We will favor towns and cities with a strong sense of community. If a citizenry cares little about its community, it will eventually care little about its newspaper. We will focus on small and mid-sized newspapers in long-established communities." So, Andrea, is that the way to go? Niche markets, small markets, very micro news.
Hyper-local. I mean, AOL has Patch, which has hundreds of sites all over the country in very small towns and doing hyper-local journalism. And trying to make a go of it. It's very difficult. I mean, I think we have not figured out a way, and I say we, the business people, have not figured out a way to replace very lucrative print ads with those eyeball-catching ads that you see on the website. They just haven't figured out how to do it. And Paul will probably know better about that. But I'm saying, but AOL, at the same time we have Huffington Post, where we're expanding all over the world. This week we're opening up a site in Spain. They're also doing Patch, which is very hyper-local.
Warren Buffett doesn't care so much about newspapers that have strong ties to their communities. He cares about newspapers that have little competition in their communities. It so happens that if you are the owner of the Goochland Gazette, which is one of the 60-plus papers that he bought, there isn't a lot of competing media, television and radio, to take away your advertising base. There isn't even a lot of internet connection, relatively speaking, in those communities. The penetration rate of the internet is relatively lower. Therefore, the newspaper is what it used to be in big cities. It's an oligarch. In fact, it's more than an oligarch, it's a monopoly. It is the place where the hardware store and the movie theater and the supermarket have to go to get the message out because the alternatives are not very good. Warren Buffett, this is no news to anybody, is a very smart man. He is buying at a relatively low price newspapers that still have a market that is protected somewhat compared to the big metropolitan newspapers, which have lost that market.
Okay. Clay, why haven't big newspapers been able to emulate that kind of model? I mean, you take Seattle, for instance. I mean, we mentioned the fact that the Post-Intelligencer has disappeared. It's now just an online site, but there's still the Seattle Times.
Well, it's exactly what Paul just said, which is it used to be really good to be a big city newspaper because you essentially had either a monopoly or effectively a cartel on all local display advertisement. I'm actually a big skeptic of the Buffett acquisition, not of Buffett's ability to make money. He'll make money on the deal. But in many cases, he's going to make the money from the interest being paid on his loan to Media General rather than the revenues from the papers he bought. And frankly, he bought those papers at such fire sale prices, he might make money on the underlying real estate if they were all to go out of business. So I don't think that that the Buffett deal, not only do I not think it's a generally applicable model for big city papers, I think it's a wasting asset even in the small towns because eventually both internet penetration and competition for ad dollars are coming there. What's happened to the big city papers is that the competition for ad dollars started there first because businesses like Craigslist and Groupon and Google Search and so forth, the businesses that could offer advertisers a better deal for less money, moved in and took the display ads in the larger cities first. So Seattle is a canary in the coal mine. But eventually, I mean, Buffett in his very strange memo after the Media General deal talks about, soliciting his employees' best ideas for the right blend of print and digital. But the eventual blend of print and digital is going to be digital. Right? Print is going to go away. And so the real question for the Buffett deal is how long has he bought himself for those papers to transform into online-only outlets, and can they do it? Not, will we still have newspapers in small towns? At some point, the printing press is closed.
I think that's very correct. And there's one other factor that no one really talks about in the decline of big city newspapers. It's not just the competition from digital. It's the destruction of the department store business in America. There used to be in every town 3, 4, 6 department stores, all of whom spent lots of money in the local newspaper. Now there's about 1, maybe 1.5 that do so.
Right. There is
closing of auto dealerships is having some of the same effect.
Right. I mean, Andrea, I'm wondering if there is somewhere a synergy between print publications and what's online. I mean, there's a publication right here in Washington, which is called Politico. Now, it's better known as an online news, distributor of news online. Yet it has a daily newspaper which comes out. It's a niche market. It's political. It's read by everyone.
Apparently, that's where they make their money.
Right.
Right. Is in this little print print thing that they do that nobody knows about. But most of their
and it's given away free.
And it's given away free because circulation. What are they going to get? But the ads are because it's a very targeted audience. It's a very powerful here in Washington kind of audience. But matter of fact is, and if they didn't have that print outlet, it's not clear that they would make money because it's a very expensive.
I think they've admitted to that as well.
I think they have admitted to it. Now they have Politico Pro, which is sort of a subscription. If, you have to pay a subscription, and that is sort of on the Bloomberg model, which is very lucrative, as I understand it. At Huffington Post, we don't believe in in charging, and despite what we get for our aggregation, we do a lot of original reporting, and we do give people an outlet for for opinion, and which is still very valuable. I know it's controversial, but I can't tell you how many people come and are always asking me, how can I get my column on the Huffington Post, because we have such a huge audience.
And you have dozens of bloggers there as well.
Well, that's what I'm talking about, the bloggers, and they don't do it, they don't get paid for it, but they have a huge audience, and it really, if you just look at the comments on the Huffington Post, if you were just to judge the readers from that and compare it to some of the more establishment newspapers, I think we really do pretty well.
To me, the remarkable thing about Politico is that they have figured out a model that basically balances the revenues of digital and the revenues of print. Now, it's a very extreme and perhaps even exempt kind of model, because they appeal to a very narrow audience on Capitol Hill, and their advertisers are those associations, trade associations, the lobbyists that want to appeal to those people on Capitol Hill. There's no way a newspaper can exactly replicate that in Chattanooga or some other place.
It's a cross-subsidy, though, isn't it? I mean, it's a newspaper subsidizing.
But it's all a cross-subsidy.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the great problem with thinking through the newspaper business is people want to think of newspapers as a business, but they're actually two organizations. There's a wildly profitable, or was a wildly profitable, printer of a local advertising circular. And then there was a nonprofit newsroom that got subsidized by the department stores and the car dealerships. So newspapers have been bundles of cross-subsidy since literally the 1830s. And when the commercial side collapsed because of the various digital effects on the advertising market, there's one group of people who think we must save the newspaper, and there's another group of people, of whom I'm a member, who are concentrating just on saving the newsroom.
All right.
I think we need this kind of subsidy for the newsroom, which is one of the things that Politico has figured out.
Okay, Clay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that is it from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And of course, we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for joining us.